Okay, welcome to this Rightful Lives video focusing on the Dispatches documentary written and produced by Richard, who we're very lucky to have here with us today. So some quick introductions. My name's Alexis Quinn and I work with Julie at Rightful Lives. Julie?
I'm Julie at Rightful Lives, and I'm also mum to an autistic man who spent time in hospital but is now living a great life in the community.
Thanks, Julie. Dawn?
Hi, I'm Dr. Dawn Kavanagh. I have autism myself, and I have an adult son with a learning disability, an autism, an epilepsy and ADHD who's currently locked up in a psychiatric intensive care unit.
Thanks, Dawn. And Richard?
What?
Who are you?
It's a complicated question that can't be answered in a short period of time. I'm the person that made the Dispatches that was out last week, I think, or the week before. I can't remember now. On autism, I'm autistic. I also have ADHD, which is brilliant. And I have a physical disability. So I got the full royal flush.
Richard's documentary was very important for lots of reasons. I mean, firstly, it was the first documentary that I've seen certainly that featured solely autistic people, and hearing directly, from them in an unfiltered way was certainly had a sort of profound impact on us at Rightful Lives. So I was just wondering, Richard, what was your motivation for making this documentary?
I think my motivation really was the same as it has been for all the films that I've made for television about disability, which is to control the narrative, to allow disabled people to control the narrative. In this instance, autistic people who have been or are inpatients in hospitals, partly because I feel that a lot of the films that you see, particularly about this subject, are often undercover films where somebody goes in, works as a staff member, and you see lots of terrible things happening, but somehow the patients are still objects. You don't hear their narrative, right? And so it's difficult, I think, for an audience to engage with these people, us, if you like, without being able to see, feel, and hear that they are just regular people who have a particular perspective on the world, if you like. So I think that my main thing was basically so you could hear from people who are autistic and inpatients firsthand their testimony. That's why I didn't do an undercover film. That's why I tried to do it this way, because I felt that that was important. And that's why apart from the psychiatrist, the other expert, I use that inverted commas, was James Cusack from Autistica. Now we have problems with Autistica, obviously, but he is an autistic CEO. He is autistic himself. And so I tried to keep the whole thing basically, to control that narrative.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I mean, it did make such a difference. And I know that, from your feedback, people that don't know about the scandal, that haven't experienced, inpatient care, or perhaps don't have somebody that's autistic in their lives and maybe don't experience that struggle, were genuinely, very shocked and horrified. I guess, for many autistic people, very sadly, who do have experience of the system, the scenes were, for some of us, really quite familiar. And I was just wondering, how you think people come to be in these inpatient beds. What's your experience, Richard?
I think there's a variety of reasons. One reason often, I think, is that usually an autistic person's mental health crisis is triggered by a life event of some sort, either a bereavement, say a close relative, a brother, sister, whatever, or a relationship breakdown, or some major life event. And that causes an autistic person to, I suppose you could say, emotionally dysregulate. It's very difficult to handle. And if you're in an environment, say, for example, like Lauren, the young lady who died, who took her own life, your older brother dies, you have the meltdown, a kind of long-term continuous meltdown. It's difficult for your parents or other people around you to handle because they're also trying to deal with a major life event. So what do? You go to the people you think are going to help you. You go to the mental health professionals. You go to them because you want help, and you live under the illusion that the mental health care system is going to help you. And then you find yourself trapped, right? Because that brings me to the second reason, which is that often to mental health professionals with no real awareness of autism, and most of them don't have it because autism is not a mental illness, so they're not trained to deal with it. They can perceive a meltdown as a sign of mental illness. They can then interpret everything that you as an autistic person say or do through that lens, and you can end up sectioned. And that's why I didn't go to mental health professionals when I was having my crisis, because I know, having once been in mental hospital, that everything you say and do is perceived through a very particular lens, and that nothing you say or do, once that decision has been made, will change it. Well, that's why I think autistic people end up, I mean, autistic people do have mental health crises, and in some occasions, it's not universal. In some instances, it is right and proper to hospitalize somebody, right? As long as all the other factors are in place and it's understood, it can be helpful. It's not entirely destructive. But in far too many cases, autism is not understood by mental health professionals or staff that work in mental hospitals. Most staff that work in mental hospitals are pretty undertrained. And you get scrutinized by both the staff and by the other patients. So it becomes a kind of cyclical situation which gets worse and worse and worse. And so autistic people can end up trapped in mental hospitals even when they do not have a mental health condition.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I mean, it's interesting what you said about sort of bereavement, isn't it? I mean, that's how I ended up in hospital, and I know that that's, you know, a big part of sort of that reason for Danielle's admission, you know, when her brother died, and for me when my brother died, you know. And I think it's when that sort of big life event, you know, happens, and, you know, things change, isn't it? And that, you know, things become sort of suddenly very unfamiliar in your familiar environment, that you can be taken to an even more unfamiliar environment, and often that is how you get stuck. Dawn, I'm just wondering about your son.
Well, I think right from the beginning, Jack's always been in an inappropriate environment. But I think the other thing that has always been missed in Jack's case is trauma history and the understanding of that trauma history. And Jack's had significant bereavements as well, which have always been overlooked. Big life events like almost dying from sepsis, and all these things have been overlooked, and the impact on him, and also being placed in really inappropriate environments where he's had to deal with a lot of noise and people walking through his environments. And then when he hasn't been able to cope with that, he's been placed into even more inappropriate environments. And then he just becomes trapped in the system. But then the other issue is that lack of a home and the lack of community provision, which keeps him therefore trapped within the system. So he doesn't have a mental health condition, but he's just sort of stuck there.
I think that there's a couple of other issues here around autism, learning disability, and autism, people with autism without a learning disability. The autism learning disability cohort, if you like, is quite well understood, quite well known about within mental health provision. One can argue that they don't do their job properly, but I think the thing I was also looking at was that none of my contributors had a learning disability, and I think there's a huge cohort of autistic people without learning disabilities who are not catered for or not acknowledged. And I think that there's an issue around liability and provision. So they don't let people out of hospital because they're worried. The authorities are always worried about liability, right? Always worried about, are they going to get the blame? So if they do let somebody out of a hospital, they put them into basically a kind of like self-contained bungalow that's like all the furniture is made of lead and everything's padded, and they've got 5 staff all the time. And they don't really take it's not even a risk. They don't even really take the opportunity to allow people to have their freedom and to establish their own life with a minimum of intervention, but the maximum amount of support. The support, as it's perceived by the authorities, is always interventionist and controlling rather than supportive and liberating. I think that's a big issue across the entire the entire sort of autistic situation is that it's very poorly understood by the general public. We need to be able to stop people being frightened of us. Does that make sense?
For sure. I mean, Julie, what do you sort of think about that? And in terms of the community, because we're seeing a lot of basically long-term segregation, aren't we, in the community at the moment?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more obvious that some people escape from hospital only to end up in some kind of mini institution, pretty much as Richard just described. I can think of a few examples right now where people are, surrounded by staff, never go out, and their environment is there to help the staff more than it is to help the person. It's nothing to do with what's right for the person. I mean, I can talk a little bit about how we set Jamie's home up, because we try very much not to do that. He's got a small staff team, no agency staff, they all know him. His home is an ordinary house in an ordinary street. It's got some, very unobtrusive modifications to make cupboard doors stronger and stuff like that, because he's a strong guy, and little bits and pieces. But it's furnished with apart from a reinforced bed, which he does like to bounce on his bed, but it's furnished with stuff that I just went out and bought in a high street stores. It's not lead furniture or he hasn't got padded walls. It's just an ordinary environment with his stuff, and he puts it where he wants to put it. He's got little cogwheels that he likes to have around the place, and it's for him. It's centered on him and what he needs, and it works. It works, and I don't understand why we hear so many of these places that are set up as Richard described, where it's a prison. It's a prison in the community.
I mean, in my opinion, it is the risk-averse nature of the various authorities and the fact that they are determined to avoid liability. I spoke to a whistleblower who didn't feature in the film because of time constraints. A nurse senior nurse who's been working for 20-odd years, 25 years in the system. And he describes how the risk-averse nature of the system does two things. One, it keeps people locked up. But two, I think his most important point really was that the source of any problem is always located in the patient, right? Yeah. Not in the toxic dynamic of the care system. Right? And what you saw at BrightMet, because the thing is, BrightMet, where Amy was, is still open. It's still taking admissions. There are still people in there who are non-verbal, therefore cannot do what she did. And she suffered as a result of speaking out. And the problem for, I think, a lot of mental health authorities is that if you are like Alexis or like myself or like Amy, right, then you are intelligent, you are smart, and you've got a voice, and you won't take any bullshit, and you will call them out. But if you're getting a shit service, it's okay to say, hey, this is rubbish. But in a mental health setting, that's just viewed as
aggression.
Yeah, it's viewed as non-compliance. And if you're not compliant, if you're not a docile body, right, then you're just trouble, and you just get worse, and you just get treated worse and worse and worse. And if you're smarter than the people who are imprisoning you, it is a problem, right? Because you're in a situation where you can't win, because it's not set up to help you live an independent life. It's set up to keep you away from being annoying to your neighbors and people in your family. I mean, this is the thing people don't understand about section. So I was continually asked when I was making the film, what were they sectioned for? What were they sectioned for? And I'm going, they're not sectioned for anything. You're not sectioned for psychosis, or you're not sectioned for schizophrenia. A section is merely a legal way to remove somebody's liberty without them having convicted a crime and therefore being sent to prison. That's all a section is. By virtue of a mental disorder, you are considered a risk to yourself or others, right? And that's all it is. It's just a way of taking you off the street and sticking you somewhere, right? And that's all a section is. And that's why I didn't go, because I as an autistic male of a certain age, living on my own, who was like clearly bonkers at the time, I was pretty sure I would be sectioned. But I have a network, I have support, I have people around me, and it was okay in the end, right? And that's what my motivation for making the film was that I can't say in the film, don't go near mental health professionals because they will lock you up, right? But that's kind of what I think. If you're autistic and you're having a crisis, the last people you need to help you are most mental health professionals. Not all of them, but most.
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I'm in that sort of situation at the moment, Richard, you know, and even when you're sort of knocking on the door saying, I do need something, you know, you can't get anything. We've just got a couple of minutes left, Dawn. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to ask Richard about, because what really interested me as well was Sean and what happens when you come out and the lack of support there, which can put you at risk of being resectioned. And I found it really interesting with the care plan, and it's just awful to watch. And I wanted to ask, I mean, I have my own opinions on why you felt it was so important to put that in, but I just wanted to ask you on your own thoughts about that and about the care plan, which just seemed to be a paper exercise.
No, it was just another example of, it's just another example of a paper exercise. Sean is legally entitled under Section 117 to aftercare that he is not getting because they have no staff, right? And that, you know, so he's just left abandoned. Fortunately, he's found another support network and he's okay, right? But it's him that sorted that out, right? And it's not a professional network, it's his faith network. But the point is that there was supposed to be, and there is legally meant to be, all this stuff, but it's not there, and there's no regulatory enforcement to make sure that this happens, right? So there's a code of practice that the NHS don't stick to, right? They're meant to do things, they just don't do them, and they hope that someone like me doesn't come along and stick them on telly for not doing it, right? But that's pretty standard. The shoddy nature of his care plan is, in fact, as far as I've understood from various other experts, reasonably standard within the NHS, and we could discuss why that is. There's lots of reasons, but ultimately, no, he got discharged and he's got housing, but he's got absolutely no mental health support other than the stuff that he's found for himself. And I think that happens to loads and loads of people, autistic or otherwise. I mean, this issue, while we're discussing autism and autistic inpatients, of course, affects all people in mental health hospitals.
And it's ironic, isn't it? It's, you know, that very lack of community support, which means that you might go in when you come out. It's that very thing again, which leaves you vulnerable to going in. Well, thank you, everyone, today. That brings us to the end of this episode of Rightful Lives, thinking about certain issues, and just a massive, massive thank you to Richard for everything that he's done and continues to do for the community and for appearing with us today. Thank you, Richard. If you or a loved one require assistance, the following organisations, groups, charities or people might be able to provide support.